Good morning, everybody. My name is Jean Bajolan, and welcome to This is Revolution podcast. I'm in today for Jason and Pascal, and we have a wonderful show lined up for you today. It's a deep dive into Iraqi Kurdistan and the recent set of protests that have rocked the region. And we have three wonderful guests and a very special co-host to discuss this issue. But before we begin, I would like to remind you all to like and subscribe. And if you are so inclined and have the means, please consider becoming a patron. It helps both Jason and Pascal buy their orange juice because neither of them drink. So without further ado, let me bring on my very special co-host for the day. He is the Paul Atreides of Rojava. He is, of course, Stefan Bertram-Lee. Hey, Stefan, how are you doing?
I'm good. The intro music is staying lit. It's great.
Yeah, well, that is just so that everybody knows. That is all Jason's original music. This is not. We're not taking music from anyone. This is Revolution original hits. So, I think it's a little bit controversial. On the Apple podcast, some people are very concerned about the loud nature of the music, but it is what it is. It's like, sometimes revolutions are not so friendly. So before we bring on our guests, I have a little introduction video to get our viewers up to speed on the situation in Iraqi Kurdistan and what's been going on lately, and just to set up the situation. So I'm going to play that little video now, and then we're going to introduce our guests.
Thousands of Kurdish students took to the streets of numerous cities in northern Iraq, including Suleimania and Erbil, on Tuesday, demanding their monthly stipends be restored by the autonomous government of Iraqi Kurdistan. Due to falling oil prices and a costly campaign against the Islamic State terror group, the government stopped paying the stipends, worth about $50 in 2014.
Look, all the young people are leaving this country. They are all gone. They have left the region because of these thieves.
Protests have been going on in Suleimania for 3 days. They reportedly grew bigger and more violent on Tuesday. Local media report that several protesters were injured and security personnel deployed tear gas to disperse the crowds. Protesters also set fire to the city's ruling party's offices. Some shouted more radical slogans such as "Down with Family Rule," a reference to the Barzani and Talibani families' 3-decade duopoly over the oil-rich region.
We have students who have deferred their studies because they have no money. I know a few girls in the dorm who wash their friends' clothes to earn some money for that day.
Even though the regional parliament had a special session on Tuesday to debate the problem, the protests showed no sign of subsiding. In an attempt to calm the crowds, authorities at Suleimania University scheduled a 2-day recess. But on Tuesday, at least one university dean joined the protesters to show support for their demands.
We support the students' demands. We consider them legitimate and within their rights.
Students in Suleimania barricaded major roadways, promising to keep protesting until their demands are met. For Dilshad Anwar in Suleimania, Iraq, Bejan Hamdard, VOA News.
Okay, so without further ado, let me bring on our guest. So our first guest of the day is Dastan Jasim. Jasim, a Doctoral Fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg, and a doctoral candidate at Friedrich-Alexander University, Erlangen-Nuremberg. She researches on Kurdish political culture in Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey. She's a conflict researcher at the Heidelberg Institute for International Conflict Research, focusing on the Kurdish conflict in Syria and the war against ISIS since 2017. So welcome, Dastan. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, we're really glad that you were able to make it this morning. I really appreciate it. So our next guest is Lana Askari. She has a PhD in social anthropology with visual media from the University of Manchester. Her PhD research is focused on how people in Iraqi Kurdistan imagine and plan their futures in times of crisis, for which she produced the film Bridge to Kobane in 2016 and Future Factory in 2018. She currently works for the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is a teaching fellow at the University of Amsterdam. Welcome, Lana.
Thank you, Djene. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here as well. It's great to see you. Lana is an old friend of mine going back to, I think, 2014 when we first met. So we it's really great to see you and really looking forward to seeing the movies you've been making. And the final guest for the day for this super panel on Kurdistan is Abdulla Hawez. He is a researcher with a private consultancy firm in London focusing on Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, and he has worked for the BBC World Service, the Daily Beast, as a journalist. He is also the co-founder of Yalla News Organization, which was founded in 2014, but he is not affiliated with that organization anymore. Welcome, Abdullah.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's just get right to it, because there have been protests in Iraqi Kurdistan. Students were at the vanguard of these protests, but, there have been more general protests by other elements of society in the autonomous region of Iraqi Kurdistan, which basically, for those who don't know, is basically a state within a state that has existed since the first Gulf War and the creation of the no-fly zone. So, although the region is technically part of Iraq and does not enjoy complete, economic and political sovereignty, internally, it is governed by Kurdish political parties, and two political parties in particular, the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, who basically have controlled that region since 1990. And what we've seen is a wave of protests. These aren't the first protests to have taken place, but a wave of protests in the last couple of months, which have been accompanied, of course, by waves of refugees. People may remember there was a refugee crisis in Belarus, and many of those refugees were actually people coming from Iraqi Kurdistan. So the conditions in Iraqi Kurdistan are very unstable. Many people are unhappy with the current administration, and basically things are not going the way that perhaps the regional authorities that govern the region would like them to go, especially as they seek to maintain their autonomy vis-a-vis Baghdad and build cooperation with international powers, particularly the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. So the first question I have for the panel, which I'd like to start with Dastan, is what triggered these protests exactly?
Well, I mean, for the first part, it was obviously what was quoted most was that it was about the stipend that the students had so far. So depending on where you're coming from and where you're studying, you would have a stipend that would, if you would convert it into euros, would go from, sorry, something is going on. Was that my?
That's Abdullah.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. But that's good. That's why we're not live. So the protest started off with demands to get the stipend back. So since 2013, most of the students didn't get their stipend. Normally, there was around, if you would count it into euros, 50 to 30 to 60 euros. Really, not really so much. A little stipend that they would have in the month. And yeah, they didn't get it since 2013 because of, the excuses were the financial crisis, that, there was a financial crisis because of the low oil prices, because of the refugee crisis, all of that. But basically, the issues are going much, much deeper. We shouldn't forget that last year, this time, we also had a huge protest wave in the Kurdistan region, and that these protests were actually met with fierce violence. At least 8 people have been killed. The youngest was a 13-year-old young man who was killed. And these protests were also sparking because of the general crisis that the Kurdistan region is having. So while we see that first it started very issue-based, which is very typical in the Kurdistan region, we had teacher strikes, we have strikes of different sectors in the public sector, we have youth strikes, we have women's movements. We always have very issue-based points, but then it just develops to a very systematic issue. And I remember very well last year, I did an interview with Shirin Kawa Garmiani, who was the MP for the Goran Party, and who is the widow of Kawa Garmiani, who was a journalist who was killed for his work. And she said she was also joining the protests. She was injured last year. And the thing that she told me last year, and that I think is counting right now as well, is that she said, this is very different from everything that we had 10 years ago. People are not demanding reform, they're demanding revolution. So that's really the direction where things are going.
Abdulla, what are your take? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, Dastan pretty much summarized the situation, but in my opinion, the situation is a bit more complicated. First of all, the recent protests have been rather small. I mean, and mostly focused on Suleimania in eastern Iraqi Kurdistan. And the reason, in my opinion, is deeper. It's mostly psychological. Many people have been psychologically feeling defeated. This is why we have this wave of leaving the region. It's basically, in my opinion, the ultimate resentment with the situation. They are just they have lost hope. In my opinion, this is the feeling of majority of people. I mean, these small protests you see, for example, the students who protested for a few days demanding their stipend, but it was only for a few days. And based on my observation, talking to people in these regions, the numbers were small, and it basically died down after a few days because there's not, this this motivation anymore. Even when it comes to such small issues, in my opinion, the people are psychologically so tired, and it's partially because there has been what I call some golden years from 2005 to 2013. The situation at the time, I was living in Iraqi Kurdistan at the time myself, the situation was really very promising. Economically, the region was doing really, really well. Everybody was having a good job. The salaries were far higher. It was easy to find a job. Politically, things were much different. It was the times that Goran was, becoming a movement, and it was pushing the boundaries of freedoms, of demanding more accountability. Everything was kind of, was, people feel everything was promising. There was a kind of a bright future ahead. But then suddenly, out of nowhere, in 2014, everything turned upside down. It was a massive trauma, I think, for most people, because in 1 year, things became so bad that the KRG couldn't even pay the salaries of the civil servants, which is basically the bare minimum of a functioning government. So after that, not only things didn't go back to normal, which people were hoping, because these few years became kind of like a yardstick. Everything, people are measuring everything based on what was happening in these few years. But obviously, things are not going back to these years, especially since Masroor Barzani came to power in 2019. Things have become worse, especially politically. He's much more authoritarian than Nechirvan Barzani. He doesn't, tolerate criticism, which is making things even worse. A friend of mine was comparing what was the situation, around 2017 or 18 when Nechirvan was still in power compared to 2020 when he went back. He said, in terms of freedoms in Erbil, things are so bad, people are afraid even to, make mild criticisms. Things are much worse. So in addition to that, now you have a skyrocketing of taxes, of bill services, in addition to people not being able to, even finding a job. So for many people, the taxes are much more than they make, which is, I don't know how they manage to pay their bills, but it's becoming so bad. This is why everybody is trying to find a way to just leave. My own friends, I have some friends who were the type of people who were always criticizing people for leaving, Even now, they are so hopeless that they think there's no future. They just want to leave. So in such a situation, you may see some protests, but in my opinion, I wouldn't pin so much hope on them because I know psychologically people are tired. I don't think they will. I don't think we will see a serious big kind of revolution or protests that pave the way for revolution because of these situations. Of course, also because of the way things are in Kurdistan in terms of geopolitics, the role of Turkey, Iran, Baghdad. It's really complicated, but for me, this is the take that psychologically people feel very tired, and this this wave of refugees that we see is basically this.
Well, before I move to get Lana's opinion, especially because she's worked on what people's views of the future are like in Iraqi Kurdistan, I just want to provide a little bit of context for our viewers who are not familiar with Iraqi Kurdish politics. Both Dastan and Abdullah referenced the Goran movement, and for people who don't know, as I mentioned at the beginning, the two dominant political parties in Iraqi Kurdistan are the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. But Goran was a split from the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, led by one of their veteran leaders, which became a kind of opposition movement, which was particularly powerful in Suleymaniye, which is the heartland of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, but also was able to gain support in Erbil, the regional capital as well. So that was a kind of important movement. And another important piece of context is that the dominant political party in Iraqi Kurdistan, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, is dominated by the Barzani family, and for much of the post-2003 era, region leadership, effective leadership and governance within that within the regional administration was led by Nechirvan Barzani, who was the nephew of the leader of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, Masoud Barzani. But in the last couple of years, power has shifted away from Nechirvan to Masoud Barzani's son, Masroor Barzani, who comes out of the intelligence services and basically is much more of a security-oriented figure. So they're both from the same family, but there is definitely a kind of difference in the way that the two have sought to govern, probably shaped by their political experiences. So I want to kind of move to Lana. What's your take on this issue? Do you agree with the idea that there's very little hope about the future in Iraqi Kurdistan as compared to how things were before 2014, which we should note was when the oil crisis hit and the money that was flowing into the region kind of dried up?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what I wanted to add to what has been said already is that firstly, what struck me about these recent protests was that it was very much centered around Kurdish youth and students. Whereas previously in a lot of the protest or demonstration, it was more gathered around civil servants or just the general public indeed. And people were afraid after every few days of protest because they were obviously struck down by security forces. And so you'd have like a kind of momentum of protest, beaten down, and then a moment of nothing, and then they come up slowly again. So I thought for me what was interesting to see is how the youth and students were actually going on the street and demanding a right.
Hi.
I think we're still trying to get Stefan in. Oh, good. Okay, I'll continue. And what also struck me about that is that, who are these students actually? Because these are students from public universities. And we have to distinguish the differences between the public universities in the Kurdistan region and the private universities that, either ask for a lot of tuition fees and money, or only people from wealthy families can go there, or only people with certain types of connections can go there. So we also have to make that distinction. Who is actually going on the street and who are these students? And most of them would be from public universities that either don't come from wealthy families, or indeed travel to another city to actually gain education in another city and live in dormitories. And that little bit of money, those few like 30 or 60 euros would actually help them a lot, because without that they would not be able to survive. So I think we need to make that distinguishment first. Secondly, what I wanted to add is that what was really interesting to me as well is that back in 2015-16, I did my fieldwork in Slimani, actually. And one student from the University of Slimani told me that he was graduating. And at the time, he already said, because this is just the year after ISIS came, after the economic crisis started. And so all the kind of hopes and dreams people had for Kurdistan and even maybe becoming, an independent country, they completely were struck down. And he said, actually, after graduation, I only have 3 options. The first one is to leave for Europe. And the second and third one, depending on your ideology, would be either to join ISIS or the PKK. Now, I think for me, what was really interesting about this was not so much the fact that the student was going to do any of these things, but I think what struck me about that was that all these options were actually a form of leaving. Mm-hmm. And by actually staying within the system that was becoming more repressive and had no future whatsoever in terms of in the job market in the same region, any kind of space for that, whether in the private or public sector. If you would stay, you would become complicit in the repressive regime that you live in. And I think that complicity is something people don't want to take part in anymore. And that's what we see continuing now with, it's been already 6-7 years. And nothing has changed. Actually, it's gone even worse, I think, in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of basic services. People are being squeezed so much, so they will try. But maybe like Abdullah, I'm also not super hopeful that it would lead to any changes. But I am very, maybe not happy is not the good word, but I am really astonished that youth have taken it upon themselves to organize themselves and go on the street and demand, even if it is a little bit of money. Yeah.
So we've given so far kind of quite a
bit. Jump in for one small addition, because obviously we have 2 ruling families, but Kurdistan is somehow 2 regions as well. It's 2 systems. It's not only 2 different political parties who are ruling. It's basically 2 systems. Erbil and Duhok are ruled by KDP, even in terms of the police, security forces, the intelligence agencies. Everything is really very different from Suleimaniya. So in a way, we have two different societies, although we talk about Kurds in Iraq, but it's really in many ways, because one of the reasons I'm saying that is most of the protests have been in Suleymaniye. They have hardly moved or started protests in Erbil or Dohuk, because the dynamics in this region is really very different from Suleymaniye in many ways. So we have to consider this distinction, because most of the protests and what we have been discussing is happening in Suleymaniye, where things are quite different from Erbil and Dohuk.
I think that's a very important point for our viewers to understand. Although formally, in a legal sense, the Kurdistan region is an autonomous, unified region, the reality below the surface, and this has existed since the 90s, is that the Kurdistan Democratic Party controls the majority of the region and operates as a kind of one-party state where state and party are fused. And then in Suleymaniye, you have the same situation with the PUK operating a kind of one-party state in which power, the state power and the party power are fused. And I think an important piece of context is that, we saw this in the last elections, actually. The KDP still maintains a kind of solid base of support amongst, let's say, socially conservative right-wing nationalists. The PUK, which functionally, in policy terms and in structural terms, is not that different from the KDP, but at least theoretically comes out of a left-wing movement, has severely degenerated in terms of its legitimacy and its ability to control Suleymaniye. The PUK was a front organization made up of several different parties initially. The KDP is a far more centralized and powerful organization centered around the core of the Barzani family, which has a tribal base. The Talabani family is not a tribal family. The Talabani leadership of the PUK does not come out of the leadership of the Talabani sheikhs. Jalal Talabani, who was the leader of the PUK, his power comes from his role as an urban intellectual and a Soviet, somebody who came out of the urban wing of the Kurdish movement and not out of the more tribal wing. So there was a kind of difference in the nature of the family power. And in the PUK, there's a bigger degeneration of that power. And, I have a number of theories. For example, the KDP treat their children like little kings. So from a young age, they were appointed to high-profile positions. I think Nechiran Barzani's son is now the head of the University of Kurdistan. He's like 23 or something like that. Whereas the PUK, Jalal Talabani's sons basically spent most of their youth smoking shisha on Edgware Road in London and then being parachuted in to high-profile positions where they hadn't built up this kind of strong base of support. So you have a kind of degeneration of the PUK, which it's happening in the KDP zone, this degeneration, but at a much slower rate because that party has a stronger structure, has a greater legitimacy, whereas in the PUK, in Suleymaniye, when I was there in 2016, even the children who are, I was teaching at the American University of Iraq in Suleymaniye, even the children of the PUK leadership were saying, yeah, it's kind of a bullshit organization. Right? Even they were admitting that it was kind of falling to pieces. I remember one Turkish businessman who told me, he said, look, I do business in Erbil because in Erbil, there's one person I bribe. In Suleymaniye, I bribe one person and then this other person wants a bribe and I have to bribe several. So I don't know who to bribe. So the PUK is very much like sort of falling to pieces a lot more. The KDP still maintain that base. The PUK and Suleymaniye is kind of the weak link of the duopoly that was mentioned at the outset. So, I want to hand over to Stefan because he had some questions to ask.
I mean, we should also mention that we were talking about Goran earlier, but in the most recent Kurdish regional election, Goran did terribly because people perceived them as not having distanced themselves enough from this duopoly. So we should be clear that there isn't kind of like an opposition waiting in the wings. And I think this tells the point that Abdullah said about there not being really much hope of an opposition. But the question I wanted to ask was, we've already given quite a bit of kind of background on the KRG in general. But to make something clear, my impression at least, and obviously the guests can see if this is true or not, is that in terms of political economy, the KRG gets basically all of its money from oil. And this is why it's so vulnerable to these oil crises, because it's like 95% of its revenue is from oil. And so talk about the relationship there. And also, I've heard stuff in regards to kind of the KRG demanding a share of Iraq's general oil money, demanding that the Iraqi central government pay its public salaries and so on. So if people could kind of untie what's exactly going on here, I think that'd be useful for the viewers.
Do you want to go first, Dastan?
Yeah, I'm actually happy that the issue of economy is coming up because this is very fundamental. I have the feeling that, even though in many cases we can see specific patterns, we can talk about tribalism and urban elites, but at the end of the day, everything has a very materialistic point and everything has a very materialistic reason. And the first and foremost reason that would pop into my mind, if anyone would ask me, why is the KDP more centralized and stronger than the PUK, is that they simply have control over way more oil fields than the PUK. They have much, much, much more money. The fact that people would still vote for KDP is that the patronage system that they have is so far just simply more efficient than that of the PUK. They're not specifically more intelligent, more amazing, more organized than the other party. It's just that, so far throughout all of the crashes, throughout all of the crises, they managed to still uphold somehow the basic of the money that they can give to their supporters. Like literally the KDP supporters that I know from Germany, they would even get a ticket to fly to Kurdistan to vote in the elections, like Iraqi elections, vote for them. And then they would come back, like no matter whether there's corona or not. So, you got to afford these kind of things. The big issue is the Kurdistan region has no production. It doesn't really have real means of production in that sense that they could have a hold of. And this has very different, various reasons. And it's also important to, be very cautious in this kind of discussion, especially when it comes to the discussion with the oil revenues. It's actually a very complicated issue. It's not as easy to say that, it's just that someone didn't pay their share that they have in a constitution and someone just, declared a referendum. It's all about politics. It's not really about Kurdistan, let alone the Article 140 areas. Djene and me know that full well as Khanaqini people, that no one really cares about that.
Well, Khanaqin, yeah. Just for people who don't know, the Kurdistan region governs 3 provinces, Duhok, Erbil, and Süleymaniye. But there are also Kurdish majority regions attached to other provinces, including Kirkuk, which is the center of the oil fields, including Khanaqin, which is part of Diyala province, but is a Kurdish majority city, and obviously parts of Mosul province as well. And Article 41, which was included in the Iraqi constitution, was designed to, these regions or sub-districts of these provinces were supposed to be given a choice over whether they wish to be governed by the Iraqi central government or by the regional authorities. And that was never implemented. Now, the big push is always about the province of Kirkuk, because Kirkuk is full of oil. Khanaqin, which is not full of oil, but full of Kurds, is obviously less important to the dreams of, which is, it's funny because obviously Khanaqin is where you get some of the most hardcore Kurdish nationalists, but is also, not really a big focus of political effort because there is not much economic benefit to gaining control of Khanaqin. So yes, I think that's an important point too.
Kurdish nationalists and communists, very important. But to get to the production side of things, so the most important thing to understand is to understand this phase after the Iraq war and what kind of economy was installed in Iraq and in general. This is not only about Kurdistan region. Before we had an economy where, most of the means of production that kind of were taking care of the oil sector, natural resources, and that kind of stuff were in the hands of the state. And the state was pretty much governing everything, whether it is where you study, whether it is where you're working, whether it is how much money you get, everything was governed by the state. The state would take care of everything and control everything. And what happened in 2003 was that basically with the American forces, everything was dissolved. All of the state companies were dissolved. And to all the tankies listening to this, no, Saddam, Iraq was not a communist, utopia. It was hell. People were killed. There was genocide. Let's just make this warning again, because people are forgetting things really quickly. But pretty much everything was liberalized. Everything was opened up. All of these state-owned companies were opened up one day to the other. All of the officials that were taking care of these duties were fired because, and that's an interesting thing to look up for those that are interested, if you compare de-Baathification to denazification in Germany, you will see that denazification in Germany actually only included some top percent of the Nazis in the state. But in Iraq, you have really 80% of everyone who has somehow worked in the state sector just being kicked out of politics, kicked out of work and everything. So we have this huge vacuum. And who came in? As we all know, private companies, and not only from the United States. A lot of private companies from Europe, for example. The first oil firm that actually catched ground in the Kurdistan region was a Norwegian company. We had companies from Turkey specifically coming in, taking over a lot of stuff. And basically, this is what happened to the Kurdistan region. Before the Kurdistan region was able to develop their own economy, after the last 10 years before the Iraq war, they were under, oil for food program. They had sanctions. There was a lot of poverty and all of that kind of stuff. All of that kind of stuff was the situation before. And then instead of being able to, bring up their own production, to produce something themselves, to, create sectors. And there is a lot of stuff that can be produced in Kurdistan. I mean, the agricultural sector was absolutely huge. The Kurdish areas in not only in Iraq, but in Syria and Turkey and Iran are traditionally the ones that are regarded as the ones that are, the wheat chamber of the country. All of these things would have been possible, but the situation was just that these political parties were already there. Political parties were much more institutionalized before any state, whether it's Iraqi federal state or Kurdistan region, were institutionalized. And they were the first partners to access when you would like to make a business deal. So each and every head of every party was the first person that a private company would talk to if they would like to make business in Iraq or the Kurdistan region. This is not only specific to the Kurdistan region. If you look up, some of the most important figures in Shia politics, for example, they were some of the most successful businessmen as well. So this is the situation that we had. So after that, nothing happened in terms of economic production. Nothing happened in the terms of really employing people in a kind of productive sector. Everything was just about how much oil do we get? How many people can we employ in what David Graeber would have called bullshit jobs in the worst way? How many of them can we employ? How many of them can we pay? And how many of them equal what share in the Kurdistan parliament and the Iraqi parliament? And that is a huge, huge, huge problem. That is a huge problem that we have to see. And I want to follow up on that point that Lana has just mentioned right now. That's very important to bring up, because there's always a lot of arguments about, that person was a Basi and that one is a Josh and that one is this and that one is that. Many people were forced to join the Baath Party. There were a lot of things that you couldn't do without being part of the Baath Party. Basically, you couldn't even, go to graduate school without being part of the Baath Party. So that's really an important point. But really, when you look at Kurdistan, the most important point is there is no production, there is only oil, and that also corrupts a lot of politics.
I think people also, the analogy with the Baath Party and the Nazi Party completely misses a very important historical point. The Nazi Party ruled Germany between 1933 and 1945. So just over a decade. The Baath Party ruled Iraq from 1968 all the way down to 2003. So it had much deeper roots in society. Lana mentioned in the chat just now that, people were forced to join the Baath Party. And I think Joseph Sassoon, who is an Iraqi Jewish historian, has written a book on this to show how much more embedded in society the Baath Party was than, for example, the Nazi Party. So this big purge that took place after the first Gulf War after the invasion of Iraq, basically liquidated the entire sort of professional managerial class of Iraq and opened it up to political parties, not just in Iraqi Kurdistan, but also across the region. The way I often conceptualize it is, in Iraq, actually before even the Iraq War in the 90s, you had infitah, the opening policy of economic liberalization taking place. And after the war and the sanctions had a dual effect on Iraq. The first effect was to cripple Iraq's capacity to launch offensive wars overseas by stymieing its economy. But the flip side was the sanctions basically empowered the state to create, to function as a patronage state, because no one could trade with the outside world unless it was through the state. So it both empowered Saddam Hussein domestically and weakened him externally. And what happened in Iraqi Kurdistan, this fundamental patronage political economy that emerged in Iraq was politically liberalized, compared to the Ba'ath system. But the fundamental political economy of a patronage political system remained in place. Dastan, you want to jump in on a point there?
Yeah, the thing is, just with the comparison with the Nazis, what we also have to remember is there was the Americans had a Marshall Plan for Germany. There was no Marshall Plan for Iraq or Kurdistan region whatsoever. There was a huge program.
There was a Marshall extraction.
Yeah, the Marshall
extraction, exactly. Like, there was absolutely no plan to invest fundamentally. And also, at the end of the day, Germany was a huge economic producer. So for them, it was absolutely clear that it would be economic suicide in Europe to just cut off Germany, to just cut off their, political and, institutional elite. There was something at stake. But as you said, Iraq was just, butchered down to a point where they were like, we might as well fight 80% of these people. No one cares. We're sending in our contractors, we're sending in our private companies, they will take over everything. We take that Marshall extraction and we call it a day.
Well, this is important. People don't realize this, but 1968 in Germany was a protest in many ways against the fact that all the Nazis were still in power, right? That's what 68 in Germany was. That's why German guilt over the war was not born in 1945. It was born in 1968 with this revolution against the Nazi elite that had continued to exist in the post-war era. So I kind of want to pass it on to Abdulla and Lana. So Lana, do you have any thoughts on this? And then Abdulla?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a remark on what you said earlier about people romanticizing time under Saddam. And often people say nowadays, instead of one Saddam, now we have 1,000 Saddams ruling in the whole country. So I think that's kind of a funny analogy to go back to. So instead of one ruler that's repressive, there's like 1,000 people that you have to work through.
Abdulla?
On the political economy, actually, for the sake of simplicity, I think we have three stages. We have from 1991 to 2003. 2003 to 2013, and then from then until now. Or maybe from 2019, we have a different situation as well. So in the 90s, Iraqi Kurdistan was under triple sanctions. Not only, you had the international sanction on Iraq and then Iraqi sanction of Iraqi Kurdistan. So the situation was kind of miserable. But I think a lot of people were busy with agriculture, which was an important economic factor at the time. But what happened after 2003 was that with the pouring of money from Iraq and the agreement of the budget agreement between KRG and Iraqi government to send 17% of the oil revenues, there was a massive, what you can call welfare state in Iraqi Kurdistan, but a very messy, chaotic one. They have employed everyone that they could. I mean, their supporters, KDP and PUK. So what happened at the time, you had many people who were having more than 2, 3, 4 salaries, with some of them with fake IDs. It was basically a time that everybody was taking advantage of the situation. And I think the blame here obviously goes on KDP, the ruling parties, KDP and PUK, because there was a competition about how many people they can obviously employ, so that, for the benefit of voting for them, or patronage system, whatever you call it. So you had this situation at the time. But from 2013, there was this decision by the Kurdish leadership to push for what they call economic independence by exporting Kurdistan's oil independent from Iraq, which led to Iraqi government cut KRG's budget, which was a major deal breaker at the time, because Kurdistan went into economic recession. So since then, there were attempts to find ways to kind of survive the economic crisis, until the new KRG cabinet came to power in 2019. The new cabinet, what they are claiming is that they have this new vision of, let's say, economic development based on privatization, based on, let's say, cutting welfare, which was a thing in the 2000s. And then you had, so the economic independence. So KRG has its own oil, but it never managed to export it independent from Baghdad. What happened is the Kurdish leadership decided to find a way through Turkey to export the oil, although, I mean, legally, it's not a legal thing, but they have found a way through Turkey with the agreement with the Turkish, with the Erdogan government in Turkey to export oil. And a share of the oil goes to the Erdogan, his family, al-Bayrak family, his son-in-law, and other people who are involved with Erdogan. So they have found a way to export KRG's oil without Baghdad's blessing, which was a major legal issue at the time. So, as I said, after that, this is supposed to have brought prosperity to Kurdistan. The idea was this economic independence will bring more money, because we will export more money than the 17% that Baghdad is, giving us. That was the idea at the time, but it never materialized, obviously. So what happened is, from 2019, Masroor Barzani with some consultants, I think affiliated with IMF, other people have tried this new economic model of basically what they are doing nowadays is they're privatizing most sectors. They have started with electricity. They are doing it with all the other sectors, even some very, let's say, small stuff like police traffic. Now they're even privatizing this. So it's getting a bit crazy, in my opinion. It's getting out of control. But for me, the issue is not only the privatization. What they are doing, they're transferring the public wealth to private companies that they control. So these companies are not actual normal companies who get these contracts, based on competition and based on, building a more efficient system. It's basically, usually what happens is in every sector, for example, in electricity, they have given the sector to 2 companies. One close to PUK in Suleimaniya, which we have discussed is controlled by PUK, and then one in Erbil, controlled, or let's say owned by KDP or Barzani family. So this is the issue. What's happening, in my opinion, the situation is getting even worse. So there's this political economic model based on not only authoritarianism, but also a more strict monopolization of the economy by the Barzani and Talabani family, especially Barzani family, where they are even trying to control small businesses. So before that, what we had was they were controlling the big businesses, but at least the small businesses, they were allowing people to kind of, do small businesses. But now they are even trying to monopolize these small businesses. So the space for people to make money is becoming increasingly small. There's not much opportunity to people, especially because what they are doing is they are not legally telling you cannot do it, but they have increased taxes so much that people just cannot afford it anymore. And for their own companies, obviously, they have ways not to pay taxes. So the competition is very unfair. So what happens is you get out of let's say, you get out competed by them. And so this way you cannot claim that they have just pushed you out of the business. It's just your own thing that you have decided to give up on your business. So this way, the space of the economic space, just similar to the political space, is shrinking for people to make money or to have a normal business. So this is the new situation.
It's the authoritarian neoliberal model.
Jen, you're talking twice.
Yeah, I think so. A friend of mine has a very interesting theory for this. She was saying that because Kurdistan is at the very periphery of this new global neoliberal order, and because we were in an economic crisis, obviously when we sought help, they were very happy to help. So the idea is based on privatization, neoliberal privatization. But in my opinion, in practice, this is not neoliberal principles. What's happening in Kurdistan is a very corrupt, very, let's say, very localized form of neoliberalism, which is not what we know about neoliberalism, at least in theory.
So there's an echo.
Yeah, you're echoing.
That's strange. Can you hear me now? Am I echoing now?
No, you're fine.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that neoliberalism in general is always kind of this way. I just think we have a more extreme version of it in Iraqi Kurdistan. Privatization in the United Kingdom, for example, obviously ends up benefiting people with political connections. But I do take your point. I think it's a very important point that because Kurdistan is peripheral, it's become a kind of experiment ground for this radical form of neoliberalism, which basically the ruling political elite is trying to fuse itself as the regional bourgeoisie as well. So it just appropriates the entire sort of business sector for itself to maintain control. And we're seeing, I mean, I want to get your guys' opinion on this. I don't know if you've been following, but there were some reports in the American press about the Barzani family engaging in business in the United States, and there was a whole rigmarole about it. A lot of I posted about this on Facebook, and some KDP people were very upset with me saying this kind of stuff. And the KRG replied that Barzanis aren't doing anything. The researcher was having an affair with an opposition activist. Like typical character slander. But Lana, do you have any thoughts on this issue, especially about corruption and about about these reports that are coming out about the Barzanis?
Not to get into much detail, from what I take from it is that they're trying to create a facade to the outside world, and doing that with a very bad way of PR, I would say, and I would actually expect more of them, which is kind of funny. They can afford it. So, I'm not really sure where this terrible PR is coming from and how they're still in this type of level of creating a facade for people, because obviously we know corruption is happening on all kinds of level there. They know, the people know, there's no sense of false consciousness in the Kurdistan region. Everyone is aware of that. And like I said earlier, talking about it, they want to free themselves from their own complicity in it, because you cannot live without that system if you want to exist there. No one can. I think it's extremely funny, but also very. It has a lot of consequences, of course, for the people involved. So I I think it's kind of a surrealistic situation there, where, what's the word in English? The Keizer zonder kleren, the emperor without his clothes.
Yeah, the emperor with no clothes. I think that's a really good description, because they all, there's this whole facade of. I would say this goes back right back to, the beginnings of the KRG, where there's this facade of, a vibrant civil society, Kurdistan,
buildings, infrastructure. We're going to be the new Dubai. I mean, this is obviously not what real wealth.
Don't forget about heli love. They have heli love. Okay.
They have heli love. Heli love is
big ass balls.
Well, what's his name? My mom, who is Lana's met my mom, who's like a Welsh lady. She has a good phrase for the Iraqi Kurdistan region. She says it's all fur coat and no knickers. Yeah, so there's nothing under. It's all fur coat and no knickers. A lot of it is facade. But I say, back in 2004 when I first went there, you had all this civil society, but behind this civil society was like KDP money or PUK money for these organizations. Like feminism in Iraqi Kurdistan is basically something to keep the
bourgeois feminism,
the bourgeois, the middle class wives of political elites or politically connected families, give them a kind of job. Iraqi Kurdish feminism is basically upper class women who have their children raised by Nepalese nannies, arguing over.
Okay, I wouldn't say that about every kind of Iraqi Kurdish feminism. Me
the elite feminism. The elite feminism. I'm talking about the ones.
Yeah, well, but who is the elite? I have been working with CGDS, and I would definitely say that's elite stuff. Working at AUIS is elite stuff. I would definitely say I'm privileged AF. But we went out there to the most, to the outskirts of, I don't know where, outskirts of Halabja, Shadazur and whatnot, to have panel discussions with people about GBV, about FGM, to talk about even queer rights. We shouldn't just fall into this kind of identity political idea of everything has to come from the bottom. I think we should be very, especially as activists, would be aware that you have to use these channels, you have to use the elites, but there is some good stuff that you can do on the way.
I would say there are people who do good. There are people who do good work. I'm not criticizing everybody who does work. Perhaps I was unfair in that sense, but I have seen, and maybe I'm wrong about this, I've seen some of the activism tends to be like highly performative people attempting to get trips to Europe to speak at conferences when they do nothing at home. Now, I actually know people, people at AUIS who had their gender center were doing like really trying to do some stuff and things like that. I'm not so much talking about that. I'm talking about the kind of top-down party officials, the top-down party officials who attempt to monopolize the voice of like the heli love music industry.
Definitely.
We try to monopolize.
Position where I'm coming from, to make that clear, because I think that is something very toxic that is happening in the Kurdistan region right now, is there is a trend that whenever something happens to a woman, whenever there's gender-based violence, whenever there's, even right now when there were protests, when young women were attacked by the police, the first thing that people say is, where are the women's organizations? As if, the whole of Baathism and dual party rule and corruption, everything is because of some feminist organizations. So I think we should just not fall into that trap at the end of the day. But, to just say something about that, because I just mentioned the protests again, and we talked before about, that the protests were more frequent in Slemani. I wouldn't necessarily say that. We had protests at Salahuddin University in Hawler where people were specifically chanting that they are there in support of the protesters in Slemani. And that's actually revolutionary for Hawler. Like, I was talking to students from there that were there on those protests on those days. They were literally, we were like fearing for our lives. Like, we were like, we knew that the students' union in the WhatsApp chat was calling upon us to go to the protest, but at the same time we were afraid because we were like, what if there is people that are from the party and they are, gathering us up there to, beat us up? And that happened. A lot of people were beaten up. A lot of women have reported they were specifically attacked. They were specifically trying to, quote unquote, dishonor them, saying that they would take away their phones, they will share photos on their phones. All of these things happened, and the young people were still resisting, and I think it's not really fair to those people that were standing up to do that. Also, we shouldn't forget the Badinan prisoners. We actually have a huge civil society movement and protest movement in Badina. We have people that were actively protesting military bases there that were detained. Some of them, we have never seen them again. In the outskirts of Slemani, in Sharazur, in Germian, and Rania, in Qaladizeh, in all of these cities, we have had protests. And even to mention last year's protests, that's also very important. Last year's protests that were actually costing people's lives were mostly focused on the outskirts of Slemani, the outskirts where people can absolutely afford nothing. So if you're talking to someone in Slemani, I don't know, in Sahola, can you ask them, how are you? And he says that he's bad, then go to Said Sadiq, go to Rania, go to Kafri, and ask people there, because those are the ones that are completely out of everything. And that's very important to mention. Of course, there's a focus on Slemani quantitatively and everything, it's just a big city. But we should also appreciate that this younger generation, and especially in the last 2 years, we see a mobilization that is going beyond the divide between Badinan and Suran. We see a mobilization that is going even beyond generational divides. We see that in the protests, even when it starts with the young people, we have seen that older people are coming and they're supporting them. I have talked to young people that were, attacked by the police, that were attacked with tear gas, that were injured, and they told me, hey, some of these old families that were living in the old city of Slemani, for the people that know Slemani, the old city, most people that are living there are really the old school Slemani people. Literally, old people were dragging us in, helping us, giving us water, really, closing the doors, securing us from the police. And I think that's super important to mention, that although there is a lot of hopelessness and everything, a lot of barriers have been broken in the last days, and we should do, justice to them as well.
Can I add to that? I think it's really important, Dastan, you're mentioning this. What I think is problematic at the moment, or has been in the past few years, is that all of this social activism, all of this kind of civil space that is, people are trying to make a difference, is not being included within the governmental level of representation. So when the government officials try to represent the country, they go for a different type of representation. And all of these other people that are doing great work, they are not part of that, because obviously most of the things they do is in criticism of the government, and they're not actually being listened to in many cases. And I think this is an issue where when you have a I don't want to say real democracy because that sounds terrible. But when you have a working space between the public sector, between the civil society, you have that dialogue. And I think a lot of this work is not being at all taken seriously by the government.
Yeah, so we're at an hour, so I would kind of like to ask people to sum up their ideas about their thoughts on the future, and their thoughts perhaps on where things are going, not only within the region but in terms of the regional players. What's Turkey? We haven't touched on, for example, the Turkish military intervention in the region. We haven't really touched on a lot of issues, including, for example, the fallout from the 2017 referendum. We could probably go on for 3 or 4 hours on this topic. But I would like to start with Abdulla and ask him what are his thoughts on the general trajectory of the region and how things are going to go, and then move to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, I think the situation in Iraqi Kurdistan, the situation is in terms of public opinions mood, obviously there is a huge let's say a huge resentment among the population. The majority of population who are not benefiting from this corrupt system. But what makes or what complicates the situation is the status of Iraqi Kurdistan, because it's not a state. It's basically sandwiched between two regional powerhouses, which have a huge stake in the region, not least because they have their own Kurdish population. So obviously, always they will intervene and they will have a say of how things will go in Iraqi Kurdistan. More so now because Turkey, for example, they have gradually increased their not only soft power but even physical presence in the region in terms of military bases. In the KDP areas, they have some 30 visible military bases, in addition to many intelligence offices in Erbil, in that people know. It's just so. It's difficult, in my opinion, to predict because of all these. But the situation in itself is ripe. But I don't think we have a readily available solution. We don't have a readily available movement to take over. We're still in this period where more morbid symptoms of this, decline of what's happening in Kurdistan is becoming more apparent. But a new movement hasn't born yet, in my opinion. But even if it does, how would the change occur? Because I don't think, given the entrenched ties of KDP and PUK with Iran and Turkey, I don't think they will let go. And in my personal opinion, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I don't think change in the normal means will happen in Iraqi Kurdistan because of this complication, because of Turkey and Iran, and mostly also because US and the West is becoming less and less interested in the entire Middle East, not only Kurds. So this will make the role of Turkey and Iran even bigger. They will have a bigger say in the region's politics. So in my opinion, there would be no actual change without an international and regional consensus due to the makeup and the way the region exists.
Lana?
Yeah, I mean, I want to add something about how the past years, what unfolded in Rojava, what unfolded with the YPG and the PKK taking a role up there and the fight against ISIS. I think this kind of also, I don't want to say inspired, but it created this kind of political engagement and momentum for a lot of Kurds in the diaspora as well, for connection between the different Kurdish parts as well. And I think this did open up space for a kind of ideological shift or a different types of future that people would imagine for Kurdistan. So I think we're kind of at the end of that momentum already, especially since Turkey is stepping up their military presence everywhere. But I don't want to let go of those ties yet. I think it will be really interesting to see how those ties, when we're talking either about international diasporic ties or, like Dastan mentioned, ties between the different provinces within Iraqi Kurdistan, what they will lead to. So yes, we'll need international presence to actually make a change, but from the grassroots onwards and the connection people have and the presence of the internet, I think people are thinking about different ways, and whether that's leaving the country or changing the country, I don't know what that will happen, but yeah, it's definitely created new possibilities.
Dastan?
Well, I think the scientist in me would definitely be pessimistic. I think the end game is about who is going to be the regional power if the US leaves. And that question is mostly between, is it going to be Turkey? Is it going to be Iran? Is it going to be the kind of Gulf, Jordan, Egypt axis that has a lot to do with the end game also in Syria? I mean, for Turkey, the thing is, I mean, we have elections coming up, and there is, some voices that say, CHP could this time make it and, get the majority and maybe things would get better. I have absolutely no reason to believe that. Anyone who is studying Turkish history knows that most of military foundations, military strategics, and also anti-Kurdish racism are coming from the Kemalist foundation. So I have absolutely no reason to believe that they're going to stop the invasions. Actually, the invasions are were prolonged for 2 years. So another JHP government is going to take that. The Raisi government is absolutely not going to hold back. A lot of the recent operations of Turkey, for example, in Choman area, were supported by Iran. So that is absolutely happening. A lot of it is depending on what the situation in Baghdad is. So we see that there are negotiations still going on. We see that the Sadrists are discussing with other Shia parties. A lot is depending on how they're going to dissolve their issues, because that is going to influence what kingmakers or non-kingmakers, the Kurdish parties, and especially KDP, is going to be to Baghdad. So this is also connected to that. So all in all, I don't think there is a good point, and especially internally, I have to repeat this. The most important point, I think, when it comes to domestic issues in Iraq is we have a bazillion militias. Like, it's not like it's only KDP and PUK. We have more than 400 Shia militias. We have ISIS sleeper cells. If there is no disarmament of these groups, we cannot even talk about the remotest form of institutionalization, because depending on where you live in Iraq, you have to, be part of some militia or support them or get some backing from them. That's it. But the activist in me is still positive, because I still see that we have a lot of connections in our day and age. People like you and me, we can talk to protesters, we can translate what they have to say, we can reach out to them, we can spread their voice, we can support them, they can support us, we can learn from each other. And the most important thing, I think, in Bashur is to open up to complexities, to be open that life is just complicated. Especially some of us leftists have a problem with that, but we have to embrace that. And nevertheless, I think there is great potential, because at the end of the day, we should remember that it was the Kurds and the internationalists who defeated ISIS in the last years.
Well, I would like to actually, before I thank everybody, Stefan, any last words you want to jump in on?
No, I haven't really spoken today, but I'm not filled with words. I'm happy.
Yeah, this was a really wonderful panel. I really want to thank everybody for participating. And to our viewers, this is part 1 of a 2-parter. And we're going to have a second discussion, but this time about some of the broader geopolitical questions surrounding why the Kurds don't have a state. And I will say to our panel, this is actually a question that people ask me all the time. And I'm like, well, it's a very complicated question, and I think it's an interesting one. Yeah, exactly. So we're gonna take a little break, and we're gonna come back, and we're gonna talk about this important issue. So for this part 1, as we say on This Is Revolution, we are out.